Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the meaning of the zodiac sign Leo and everything basically associated with that sign. So joining me today are astrologers Joe O'Neill and Nick Dagan Best. Welcome, both of you.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
Yeah, and we are recording this for those that like the data for the Virgos in the room on Wednesday, August 3rd, 2022, starting at 12:06 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. Not sure what episode this is, somewhere in the 300s, mid 300s, I would say. All right. So joining me today are two Leos. What are your credentials? First, Joe, what are your Leo credentials?
My Leo credentials. So I have a Leo sun and the Leo rising as well, and Jupiter in Leo.
Joe. Okay. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I mean, it's not like the biggest stellium in the world, but that's pretty good compared to things.
You call that Leo?
I knew that was coming.
Right. The other Leos in the room.
Hey, it's not going to be a Leo episode if we're not constantly one-upping each other. So we might as well just get into the spirit of the thing.
All right. What do you got, Nick?
And hold on, I meant to ask ahead of time, are you both comfortable sharing your charts? Do you prefer not to share the entire chart? It's fine either way.
I'm comfortable sharing Joe's chart.
Okay.
I'm also comfortable sharing Joe's chart. It's been shared here before, so.
Likewise.
Okay, here is Joe's chart really quickly for those watching the video version. So 11 Leo rising, Sun at 15 Leo, Jupiter at 22. Interesting discussion question that came up lately. And whatever your answer is, I'm fine either way. But you identify more as a day chart or a night chart?
My chart seems to work more like a night chart. I'm sure I could probably do more research as far as ZR goes, but I've had like ZR readings where night chart ZR dates seem to work better. Okay. I also have a really angular Saturn that kind of like by degree, like my moon is approaching an out of sign, like from out of sign, it's approaching an opposition with Saturn. So maybe I just feel Saturn enough to feel like it's a night chart.
Right. Well, that would be an interesting case study just because that was something I've been trying to research is this like range of twilight and when a person's born just before sunrise, at what point does it become a day chart versus a night chart and some of the ambiguity there. All right. So we'll take a rain check on that discussion. Nick, what are your credentials?
Mars, Ascendant, Sun, and Mercury in Leo.
All right. I'm going to pull your chart.
Jupiter schmoopiter.
I mean, I got to admit that tops me for Leoness for sure. For sure.
All right. We got 4-planet stellium versus 3-planet stellium. We will see during the course of the episode. Interestingly, though, both of you have the Sun and Ascendant, very similar ranges, being born basically just before sunrise. Basically with Leo rising and the Sun in Leo. So that's pretty cool.
Yep.
All right, so those are your credentials. Let me show my graphic image. This is the graphic that Paula Bellomini and I designed that just shows the signs of the zodiac. Leo is the 5th sign of the zodiac, so this is the 5th sign that we're going to be talking about in my series, doing a deep dive into each of the signs. Let's start with some stats for the sign of Leo. So for the video viewers, this is the glyph or the symbol for Leo up at the top. Leo is actually like the Latin word. It means lion from the Greek word that means lion and so on and so forth. Lion being the like animal totem that's associated with this sign of the zodiac. So Leo is a masculine or diurnal sign because it's an odd sign in the alternation between odd and even signs starting with Aries. It's a fire or fiery sign in terms of the 4 elements of earth, air, fire, and water. And it's a fixed sign in terms of the modalities or quadruplicities of cardinal, fixed, and mutable. So it's actually the second fixed sign in our series following after Taurus. So Leo is the sign that is said to be the domicile of the sun or the sign that is ruled by the sun. And it is said to be the detriment of Saturn because it's the sign opposite to one of Saturn's rulerships or traditional rulerships of Aquarius. All right, so those are all the basic stats. Are there any other basic things that I'm sort of forgetting?
Not as far as those basic stats are confirmed. Oh, there's one you're forgetting. That Leo's the greatest sign.
That's true.
You
I mean,
forgot that.
Scorpio is a little arguable, I want to say, but I mean, we could say that for the sake of this episode.
Take a world poll. Let's see how many people think Scorpio's the greatest sign.
There would be a lot of very adamant Scorpios that would answer to that. And
there are some people who would disagree with Leo. These people are known as the mistaken ones, but there's virtually no one who would choose Scorpio. That's just
all right,
absurd.
my friend. Well, if you want to put a target on your back with the world takes Scorpios,
I just got every Scorpio in the world after me.
That is
not a bright move.
That is your prerogative.
Leos are not known for being bright, just the greatest. That's all. That's
the greatest. Well, I mean, bright is a thing that we're going to come back to here pretty regularly as a keyword for Leo. That's pretty good through its association with the sun. But one last actually thing that we could mention with Leo is that, or two things actually. One, it's a hot sign in terms of the qualities, where there's different qualities associated with each of the elements. And since it's a fire sign, it's also said to be a hot sign. It falls right in the middle of the summer in the northern hemisphere. And in terms of body parts, it tends to be associated, one of the primary body parts it's associated with internally is the heart. And that's something that we'll come back to as well. What do you think, Joe? Are there any other basic things that we have to mention right at the start?
I think that really covers most of the basic stuff. The elemental qualities of fire, hotness, and dryness are something I think about a lot when it comes to thinking about fire signs in general, but especially Leo, because I think a common keyword we associate with Leo is leadership or royalty, and elementally or temperamentally, really, hotness and dryness especially kind of denotes separation or distance. And there's something about being the best or the greatest or being first or in some kind of position of authority that does create some distance. And that's getting kind of a little into the weeds of qualities and temperament right away. But those are some of the underlying things under one common keyword that I think about with Leo.
Yeah, I like that. And something we'll do throughout the course, I've done throughout the course of this series, is contrast. I do tend to use, for example, for Aquarius, the contrast of the opposite, the original Stoic assignments, where Aquarius was primarily, at least, a cold sign, or air was a cold element, and that's why it's opposite to fire in the zodiac, as a contrasting thing between the sun and Saturn and Leo and Aquarius. So that is definitely a contrast that I want to come back to and talk about a lot during the course of this, because one of the things we've done in this series is shown how sometimes you can understand the signs and their individual qualities the best by contrasting them sometimes with other signs. So that's something I think we should definitely do a lot of during the course of this episode. All right. Basic archetypal keywords. What are some basic keywords? Where do we need to start? I think we need to start, one, with the idea of centrality, of the sun being the ruler of Leo, and that being one of the main things that we'll come back to a lot, that it's not just ruled by the sun, but it's also a fixed sign. So out of the three fire signs, Aries is a cardinal sign, so it moves, it initiates things. Leo, though, being our second fire sign, is a fixed fire sign. So it wants to stay in place, or it wants to develop some sense of permanence. To whatever extent something can be permanent in this, impermanent world, the fixed signs are the ones that get us closest to that. So the concept here is going to be fixed fire as one of our primary things. And what is the most fixed and fiery thing that we know of? And it's actually the sun, which sits there at the very center of our solar system, and that all of the other planets revolve around. So there's these ideas of centrality, permanence, and other things revolving around it, which I think are at the very heart of not just the significations of the sun, but also Leo. And many of the other keywords then are probably derived from those as central significations.
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot as far as why Leo is like it is and why the sun is like it is, and the connection between those two is that centrality. And this idea of the sun having to do with selfhood and self-concept and some kind of deep internal purpose, almost divine purpose, if you will. and how that is so central to our lives as humans and is kind of a driving force. And I think with Leo being a fixed fire sign, there can be a desire that we often see bubble up into words like attention seeking or like enjoying the attention or the spotlight. There's this idea of like wanting to establish an identity and have it be something authentic and permanent in some way, which can be really challenging because, identity is fluid like so much of the world as well. But yeah, there's that huge central component to the sun in a chart and then also Leo in a chart that really, I do think it is where so many of these keywords and ideas stem from.
Right. So one of your points is what could be more central to a person than their identity or their sense of self or who they are. It's like the most important thing almost to any of us, but it's also one of the things that we almost take for granted the most.
Right.
Okay. Identity, where do you go with that, Nick, in terms of keywords, thinking about identity or centrality or fixed fieriness?
Yeah. I mean, I think of it as being, when you think of the axis of Leo and Aquarius, Leo is the individual, whereas Saturn is, Aquarius represents sort of like the greater whole, the collective with a capital C, if you will. So I think of the sun as being, like about identity, but like selfhood, individual will, and in the sense that it's fixed, it's about the essential person, the sense of a person that doesn't change, despite experience or maturity or what have you. There's something. The Leos often have a sort of childlike nature. So there's something sort of like always keeping alive the essential self that I think is also rooted in that fixedness.
Yeah, so like a youthful quality is something that's often associated with Leo. We saw a little bit of that with Gemini already as a sign as well, but Leo is definitely one of those other signs that youthfulness or concepts of youth do often come up as very central or very important to Leo.
Yeah, especially sort of the playful side. I mean, it's true. Gemini also has a sort of childlike nature to it, but it's more of the sort of childlike curiosity. Whereas Leo, it's play. Like everything is play. I mean, even when I'm doing astrology, I'm playing. I could be 5 years old on a swing set. It's kind of that same feeling, like enjoying what you do. Everything's sort of part of the purpose of everything is to have fun, to play, to enjoy, even when you're doing very serious adult things.
Yeah, I like that. And when you mentioned Gemini's childlikeness being related to curiosity, it made me think of how play in a Leonine sense can be kind of performative, or like I imagine, little kids like pretending to be an animal or something when we're talking about actual children. But there's something very performance related with Leo as well. And I think sometimes that gets kind of a bad rap for being artificial somehow or like fake, which it certainly can be. But it's also, there's something about kind of the inner world or like the you-ness, that essential nature that you mentioned, Nick, being expressed into the outward world, which is kind of a performance. And I think that's pretty central to Leo as well. So that's something I think about too.
And also just in more broadly central to the sun. I mean, that's part of what the sun does, in any chart. It is sort of the part of you that you're putting out in the world. How you're sort of presenting yourself.
Yeah, and that's perfect, and that's also probably following up on the previous sign, which was the moon and or the Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, which sort of like receives and reflects the light of the sun. And has a bit of a more internal quality. And we talked a lot about the internal, like emotional state, whereas Leo, being ruled by the sun, focuses more on this quality of emitting light, and the sun emitting things or sending things out and radiating becomes like a central astronomical keyword or concept then that just comes over into a bunch of different things. But one of those things can be performance as a means of like emitting or radiating one's light.
Yeah, that's very well stated.
Here's that again. So that might bring up, and I did want to give a shout out to Camille Michelle Gray that helped me with a lot of the research for this episode and like prep for this episode. And she appeared previously on the Gemini episode if people want to go back and check that out. And there's a link to her website there. But that makes me think a little bit also of how one of the things I've been focusing on in this series, how each sign seems to have some sort of like corrective function in following after the sign that came before it. And I think right there, we're really getting to one of the core corrective functions about Leo in following after Cancer is that Cancer's tendency to internalize things and to focus on the internal world of emotions and dreams and feelings and things like that, versus the Sun tending instead to be more extroverted and tend to focus on the external world and like putting stuff out into the external world, which can be things like performance, but it can also be things like just creating things or the process of creation in the world in general, and saying like, this is what I created. Like I created this thing, whatever that thing happens to be.
Yeah, no, that's also very well put. I absolutely think of the signs as being, successive signs are a correction of the previous sign. So yeah, absolutely. That inward sort of that inner world of Cancer is sort of turned on its head when you get to Leo, and you're presenting to the world, and like you said, creating.
Yeah, and I just recently listened to that Cancer episode, which was fantastic. And there was a lot of talk about the moon being related to fortune and body. The moon joining in the third house, which, the first through sixth houses being fortune related, and then the seventh through 12th houses being spirit related. I think of that fortune spirit dichotomy a lot too with the Sun and moon, with the moon being, again, body related. It's about our instincts, our internal worlds, and then the Sun being spirit related. So if fortune is like the world happening to us, spirit being like us happening to the world, and that also kind of relates to this kind of expressive, creative, performative quality of the Sun and of Leo that is kind of corrective to Cancer. So that's something I think about a lot, that huge shift from the lunar to the solar with these signs.
I love that. Yeah, that's a really good point, because fortune, or the concept of fortune, is that which we receive and that just happens to us or befalls us in our environment. But spirit is that which we create through free will or through choice or through action, and taking action and making choices and expressing our internal desires and our internal qualities and sort of making them known to the world is one of the things that Leo really focuses on and excels at. So that's why it becomes associated with not just performers, but also artists of all kinds and creators of all kinds.
Yeah. And again, I think Joe's analogy is perfect. And it also just applies more broadly to the functions of the Sun and moon in the chart as well. It's an extension of that. The moon being a sort of a receiver and the Sun being a sender. Or if you think of like two doors, one is an indoor, one is an outdoor. And, with Cancer, you're going inside. With Leo, you're going outside. They're moving in different directions.
Yeah, that makes me think of one person that has an interesting blend. And we mentioned her in the previous episode, which is the Cancer episode, for being a sun sign Cancer. But she actually has also, or had, Leo rising with Mercury in Leo, which is the artist Frida Kahlo. So she's an interesting blend between like Leo placements and Cancer placements, and between those two things of like her sort of intense focus on her internal world and some of the things that she dealt with and suffered with in like love or health or the loss of a child or other things like that, but then also expressing those things through her artwork and sort of putting some of those hardships on display in some sense seems more reminiscent of some of her Leo placements of Leo rising and Mercury in Leo.
Yeah, this is one of the perfect examples because she really is a Cancerian artist. She really is putting on display her, for people who haven't seen her art, I guess they have to Google it, but it really does center on on her physical body. I mean, so much of her painting, she took up painting after this really damaging accident that shattered her. She had a pole go right through her pelvis in a bus accident as she was recuperating. And so her painting was always centered on her broken body and the healing of her body and how she felt about her body. So it really is. And yet, processing her internal Cancerian reaction to that, but sort of putting it out there, putting that out, inner world out on display.
Well, and then the Leo part was that most of her paintings, I think, feature herself.
Yes,
or like
exactly.
self-portraits.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's something about that. There's something Leo teaches us about like the value and like appropriateness of like a healthy obsession almost with self and the journey that each of us is going through in life to understand and to find ourselves and sort of like dig it up in different stages and discover who we are and what we're doing here in some sense, and that can be healthy and restorative. And while there can be like downsides or shadow sides to that there can be something also that's very enriching and necessary about that at the same time.
Right. Like I even think about the sun, the analogy of like the sun being the center of the solar system, and this idea that there's like a self-centeredness about Leo or like the sun in Leo, which there can be. But I think there's something to that kind of like a genuine self-fascination or like a desire to really fully understand your own authenticity and be able to radiate that outwards. And thinking about this, even in the context of relationship, like your own self and who you are, your needs and desires, and your authenticity is such an important reference point in relationship or in a group setting or just interacting with the world. And I think there's so much focus on cultivating that and kind of honoring that with Leo.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Funny note that Michelle Gray noted in her notes in her research for this when she was helping me was that Salma Hayek, who campaigned for the Frida Kahlo film and who ended up playing Frida Kahlo in that film like 20 years ago, that biographical film, has Venus and Mars in Leo, and her Venus conjoins Frida Kahlo's first house, Mercury in Leo, which is kind of a beautiful and brilliant way sometimes that can be expressed, or that individual actors, sometimes or artists, can have astrological connections that echo or in some ways reflect the things that they're actually demonstrating through their acting or through their art.
I love that this is coming up. Just to be a little more Leo about this, the very first astrological employment I ever had in 2000 was writing articles for stariq.com. And the very first article I ever wrote for them was called Frida Kahlo and Salma Hayek, Peas in a Pod or Saturn in Pisces. And the film hadn't actually been made yet. They had only just secured Julie Taymor to direct it. So it was going to be made. And I was just writing about the fact that it was going to be made. And I wrote this whole thing about how Frida and Salma both have Saturn in Pisces and how, it applied to both their lives and how it connected them and so forth. So just as an aside, it's so lovely to be 22 years later to have the same subject coming up.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And we don't have a birth time for Salma Hayek, right?
No, she was born in Mexico, and it's harder to get Mexican birth times.
I just did a noon chart, but for those watching the video version, here's her chart with Mars at 5 degrees of Leo, if this is correct, and Venus at 22. Does that look correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and there's that Saturn in Pisces at the bottom. And yeah, they both had Jupiter in Cancer for that matter.
Yeah, I was just about to say they share that too.
Yeah, effectively, Salma Hayek was born on what would have been Frida's second Saturn return, which is always a Jupiter return as well. So that's, Frida died she died in 54, shortly after the attack on Guatemala. The last thing she did was protest that. So yeah, she died in 54. During the Mars retrograde that went from Capricorn to Sagittarius, the second Mars retrograde in Capricorn since she was born with Mars retrograde in Capricorn. So yeah, there's an interesting theme with all that as well. But Yeah, even though Frida died long before Salma was born, there's still, that sort of Saturn connection between them, I suppose.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any other examples that either of you can think of besides those two that invoke some of the, I don't know, the keywords that we're talking about or thinking of at this point when it comes to Leos? Or do you have any favorite Leo celebrities or examples that you think of when you think of the sign?
Well, I mean, I have a bunch of Leos I think about, but they're not creative people. They're more the shadow side of Leo.
Okay, well, we've been saying only positive things. So at some point in
Right.
this episode, we do have to say some negative things. So maybe that can be the good segue. So give it to me straight.
Okay.
What are some of the shadow ones?
Well, yeah, I know. I started this episode by talking about how great we are, but some of the worst people who ever lived have been Leos, and it's worth mentioning that. You get your Napoleons, your Mussolinis, your Castros.
Okay.
And even, and actually for that matter, going sort of merging that, talking about people who are both dictators and very creative, film directors like Stanley Kubrick or Alfred Hitchcock, who really did sort of, they were like, emperors in their own little realm of filmmaking, very creative people, but sort of the same kind of personalities that try to sort of control everything around them, I suppose.
Yeah, I like what that brings up. Let's dwell on that for a minute. So like the Napoleon's a really interesting example in terms of like people sometimes that gravitate towards leadership roles, let's say, and the Leo can be very good about being the person that steps up and takes charge and like leads a group of people. Because sometimes when you're in like a group of people, there's this effect where it's like nobody wants to be the guy that like stands out and wants to be the one who has to take the responsibility for like calling the shots and things like that. And sometimes there can be this gridlock where if there's nobody there to do that, nothing gets done. But if there's like somebody with like really strong Leo qualities in the room, they will step up and be like, no, I'll do it. I'll be the leader and I will take charge and lead this. And because they have this internal sense of that they know what's best to do, or that they don't shy away from the spotlight. And that's not something that's off-putting to them, but instead it's something that feeds them kind of, which I think is part of the definition in a little bit of being like an extrovert, like those people that who are energized by being in public and going out and interacting with people instead of depleted by it. So Leo in some sense gets energized by, being in the spotlight or by leading a group of people or something like that. But the downside of that in some instances, like with some of those, like let's say Napoleon can be, abusing that or going too far and trying to make oneself the center of the entire universe. And there can be this like egotistical sort of streak to that in some sense.
Yeah, there's a double-edged sword to the Leo sense of self. It's often said like Leos will take all the credit for something, but they'll also take all the blame. they'll it depends on the circumstance. So and there's truth to both those extremes, but that sense of like it all falls on them whether it really does or doesn't. It's sort of there's this sort of presumption that in fact they do.
Here's Napoleon's chart. So
Yeah.
Sun at 22 Leo and Mercury at 6 Leo.
Yeah.
Possibly if he was born around this time of day, which is possible around just before midday with Scorpio rising and the Sun and Mercury in the 10th whole sign house. Yeah. So is there anything else that what did Napoleon, for those that aren't like history buffs on 18th, 19th century, 18th century history, what did Napoleon do, or why is he a good example of like a Leo and both the positive sides and the negative sides?
Well, Napoleon, basically in the middle of the French Revolution, as it was all getting sort of too crazy and unmanageable, he sort of surfaced as a military leader. I mean, part of the French Revolution involved France being at war with every country that surrounded it. And so he took over as a military leader and really sort of countered all the military action being taken against France because of the revolution. And but that sort of spread, and he went from being a successful general to becoming the political leader of France, and people were still okay with that because the revolution was kind of ending. But then he crowned himself emperor. I mean, the most Leo thing you can do. Like in those days.
Yeah, never put it past, like never, if you've ever...
Well, no, but it's even more Leo than that. But give me a second here, because
if you give them a chance, they will crown themselves as emperor. That's all I'm saying.
But he's even more Leo than that, because usually what would happen if you had a new coronation, with a Catholic nation, the Pope would crown the monarch. But what Napoleon did was he had the Pope come to the cathedral where he was being crowned to watch as Napoleon picked up the crown and put it on his own head. Mm-hmm. So like it's just layer upon layer of Leoness. Yeah, he took it a step further. And so eventually he got too big for his britches. He invaded a few too many countries. Portugal and Spain wasn't a good idea. Russia was definitely not a good idea. And things rebounded against him, and he was dethroned. And
I mean, they like deported him in isolation on an island. Then he escaped. And wasn't there something crazy where then he comes up? He gets caught. He gets exiled. So the country they're not to
an island just off Europe.
Right. So they won't kill him, but they put him on an island, and they say you're going to live the rest of your life here, and that's it. So you're lucky, basically. But you're too... and it's an island. It's an island very close to the island. He's Corsican, and I think they put him on Sardinia or somewhere. I forget the name of it's one of those small islands close there. But they put him on an island that he grew up on. He totally could have been like, they set him up so he could have been like emperor of this little island, just to get him out of the way. But that wasn't good enough. That was enough. So he escapes. He gets back on the mainland in France, and he like raises another army. And I think at one point early on, he like goes up against another army, and they like lay down their arms and like join him or something. That's the first thing that happens. But before, it's called the 100 Days. So he escapes, he gets back to mainland France, and he's leading up an army, and this resistance force is raised up to counter him. But when they come up against them, they can't do it, and they swear fealty and get behind him. He must have had like really good hair or something like that. Like that's what I imagine is just like. He did when he was young, but by this point he's, looking more like me. Things are thinning out, and he's not quite his former attractive self. So it's all right. Well, mind you, he got his portrait painters to make him look better than he really was. That's the other thing. Yeah, that's very important piece. Jacques-Louis David happened to be in his corner, and that's the guy. That's another Leo, a Leo painter. That's a guy you want in your corner, because he'll paint you mounted on a horse, rising up the Alps with a sword in your hand and all that stuff. Well, that's another. There you go. That's picture from Wikipedia. That's low key is not like a word for Leo. Like they have to go all the way. Like the extravagance of presentation sometimes is one of the Leo keywords. Right. Look the portrait of him by Jacques-Louis David it's an earlier one when he's got his long hair and he's on his mounted horse climbing the Alps about to sort out the Habsburgs in Italy.
I love this idea that there's like a Leo painter that's like in his corner for like this ancient Instagram filter idea of like, don't worry, I'll make it look really good. That's David had been painting all along the revolution. Like one of his famous paintings is Marat when he'd been assassinated, falling out of the bathtub. Like he'd been documenting there you go. There it is.
That's good. Red cape.
So Napoleon was in charge of his own PR. And he really knew what he was doing. Like those paintings speak volumes. There is no photography yet, so that's it. That is your Instagram. So Leo has some kind of like innate sense of not just PR, but like public perception and the way they are perceived and the way the public perceives them being really important thing to them. Yeah. I mean, think of, I mentioned Alfred Hitchcock earlier, but, think of, this is a director, most film directors like sit behind the camera and they're sort of invisible, but you've got a director who was like a personality as big as his films. And he even put himself, I don't know if you know this, but like in every Alfred Hitchcock film, he would have a little cameo where he turned up. Like it's such a Leo thing to do. And so, yeah, there's that sense of like really having a sense of how you come off, how you're presented. I mean, that's what the sun's about. It's the presentation.
Right.
Well, yeah. And, I also think about how, like, what the sun physically does in our world. Like, when it's daytime, it's light outside and you can see things. The sun illuminates or reveals.
Mm-hmm.
We can even link that back to spirit versus fortune and like revelation and things like that. But on a really basic level, you see that with the charisma, or this idea of like the spotlight with Leo and the sun. It really is about like showing people something. And so there is this inherent sense of how you're being perceived or who is perceiving you. And kind of, there's sometimes this feeling of wanting to curate that to be a specific way, whether that is driven by hubris or a desire for control, or just a desire to be really true to yourself and like radiate what is authentic. But yeah, that perception thing is so huge just based on the sun being the planet who illuminates everything.
I like that. That's a really good point. And so the concept of light and what can be seen, and also illuminating things, but also anatomically, the sun is also associated in astrology with sight and with the eyes, or at least with one of the eyes in ancient astrology. So it has actually a direct connection with the eyes themselves. And sometimes like the ancient astrological text will say, if you're having like a really bad transit to like the sun or something like that, that could involve like an injury to the eye or something that sort of obscures your eyesight for a period of time.
Yeah. And, that makes me think of this phrase, like what you see is what you get, which is not always the case with Leo, because there can be curation and performance and whatnot. But there is this idea that I think of kind of being able to walk the talk, or striving to do that, trying to really put into action and like show what you're about rather than just talk about it. And so that's something I think about too, that feels kind of related to this idea of sight and things like that.
Okay. I'm just looking through my list of Leo sun people. It's like a dirty data one, but Yves Saint Laurent was a designer.
Yves Saint Laurent, yeah. I don't know much about him, but
okay. But they were a French like fashion designer, right? With the sun, Venus, and Mercury in Leo. I like that idea of fashion. Like fashion, I think, is one of the. Well, there may have been a little bit of that already in Taurus. Leo, I think, is the first one where we get to like a really fashionable sign, or a sign that focuses on fashion as part of the presentation, and like what you're wearing as an expression of your sort of internal radiation of your qualities and your light.
Yeah, I mean, think of Jackie Kennedy, a Leo, and a sort of a fashion icon. Of the notion of a first lady being a fashion icon, hadn't been a thing since Dolly Madison, maybe. Not to sort of demean anyone, but first ladies were typically seen as sort of old matriarchs, if you will. But there was nothing matriarchal about her. She was this glamorous, I mean, hell, what's the most famous uniform of the 20th century? It's probably the Chanel suit that she's wearing when her husband's murdered. That becomes like one of the most definable fashion statements of the century. Ironically, it's based on Chanel's design of the uniform she had to wear in an orphanage when she was growing up. But that's just a beautiful irony. But that's
she wore that. It was like a pink dress
with the sort of pillbox hat type thing.
But when her husband was shot in the motorcade next to her and died, she continued wearing it that day. There's a famous photo of her when
Johnson's being inaugurated,
being sworn in. And what did she say? She said, "I want them to see what they did to him," or something like that.
Yeah,
was that the
exactly? Put shining light on.
Yeah. She was like, "I want them to see." So she had Scorpio rising and the sun, Mercury, and the midheaven, the degree of the midheaven, as well as the lot of fortune in Leo in the 10th whole sign house.
Yeah.
So that is pretty good one.
And I mean, just on the themes of presidents, I mean, think about the Leo presidents we've had. And, there's three I can think of, and two of them were very Leo in the way they acted. The third one, it's a little more subtle. It's Herbert Hoover. But Barack Obama.
where he was such a flamboyant character.
Well, no, he had his own way of being Leo, but it's not quite the same way. But let's go with the ones that are more familiar to us: Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And just think of, whether you're, no matter where you stand on the political spectrum, their Leo-ness compared to, some of their peers is quite obvious.
Right. So they were both sun sign Leos.
Yeah.
So here is Obama, who had the Sun, Mercury, the Descendant, Uranus, and the North Node in Leo in the 7th whole sign house. And then Bill Clinton, who had the Sun, Pluto, Mercury, and Saturn all in Leo in the 11th house.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, we're leaving out one guy, but he's got
two Leo risings that are worth mentioning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think we know who one of them is right off the bat because.
Let's go chronologically.
Save the best for last.
So the first one was George W. Bush. So the younger George Bush was a Leo, or is a Leo rising, right? Correct?
Yeah. And he's just like Frida Kahlo, he's turned into a painter. Not quite as good, but
all right, there's his chart. So ascendant at 7 degrees of Leo, Mercury, Pluto, and Venus in Leo in the 1st whole sign house. And then more recently, we had another president who had Leo rising, and that was Donald Trump, who there were 2 different times, but when the birth certificate was released, it turned out he still had 29 Leo rising. So barely a Leo, but I think fully qualified Leo. I don't think anyone would argue that point at this point.
Yeah, I think it's worth, since he's coming up, it's worth talking about Regulus, the star, which is very close to his Mars and Ascendant. Regulus is a bright, it's one, considered one of the royal stars, a very bright star, right on the ecliptic. It's the heart of the lion in terms of its place in the constellation. And it's a star, like the royal stars, it comes with a sort of blessing / curse to it. And, the blessing is, prominence and authority and all the sort of leadership traits that, charisma, that Leo embodies, but it comes with this big sort of caveat, which is arrogance. People with prominent Regulus are punished for their arrogance. And no matter what you think of, DT, if you ask him, he's being, forget about what we think. If you ask him, he's being punished for his arrogance. He's constantly complaining about how, victimized he is and how he's the most victimized person in history and everything.
That's a good one. Let's contrast those two. And it's a little hard, obviously, because it comes down to like political takes and people's political views.
Right. But
I'm fine with that because just as an astrologer, I'm okay recognizing some of that and recognizing the two pieces. But Obama, for example, rose to prominence and power and became president relatively quickly in his career due to his charisma, or partially due to his charisma. He was also an amazing orator in terms of his speeches and things like that. But there was this charismatic quality to him. And I wasn't quite around paying attention to politics in the early 90s, but I'm sort of told that Bill Clinton had something similar in terms of a charisma.
The first time I ever laid eyes on Bill Clinton, the same way a lot of people did, was he's on Arsenio Hall wearing sunglasses playing the saxophone, which was compared to George H.W. Bush, it was so, here's this sort of young, cool, hip guy. Literally, showing off on a late night talk show. And then, the existing president, who was well qualified and competent, but just didn't have what it takes.
Yeah. So cool. That's a good keyword. I think I actually like that as a keyword for Leo. Leos are kind of cool, or coolness is like a.
Yeah, I think it's, there's a funny thing. Michael Luton said to me once that people, when they're single, act more like their opposite sign. like when they're projecting, when they're trying to sort of, attract. And so Leos will act like, I think cool is really Aquarius, but Leos will act that in the same way, like Aquarians will sometimes pretend they're Leos. There is something about that axis that does sort of transfer back and forth. And I always like that analogy, and I sort of know what he means, there is you might try to project the opposite of what you are in certain instances.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Obama had this coolness, this charisma. One of the interesting things about Obama in the 2016 election is like one of the first times I ever saw him truly mess up or be what I conceptualized as truly having a downfall through arrogance was with the 2016 election, because it was just like nobody thought Trump was going to win, and like Obama did like mock Trump like a few times during the course of that election and before it or leading up to it, of just like, you're never going to be president, that's absurd. And then it happened, and 2016 happened, and suddenly Trump won, and it surprised everyone. Even Trump that night like looked visibly shocked when he went up and gave the acceptance speech. And then Obama's basically started his second Saturn return through Capricorn. And it was this huge, like, humbling moment where all of a sudden some of those things or some of that arrogance sort of came back to haunt him a little bit when his like arch nemesis then took over the country for the next 4 years and proceeded to like systematically undo much of what he had set up. But that's a really interesting thing that arrogance can sometimes be like the downfall or can backfire on Leo as part of the shadow side of the Leo archetype.
That reminds me, this is a slightly not off topic, but just sort of going, not specifically thinking of Obama and Trump, but it brings to mind another big keyword for Leo, and that's loyalty. That's a big one. And in fact, if you want to, when you think about like history, when you want to hurt a Leo, you stab them in the back, you betray them. I think of Julius Caesar, who we don't know if he was a Leo, but he sort of, embodies Leo and that sort of leadership role and just being sort of taken down that way. That is a sort of a classic Leo takedown. So yeah, there's something about that. The loyalty people command. I mean, people we've been talking about, Napoleon enjoyed, as we've demonstrated, incredible loyalty. It's a Leo sort of value, and arguably the highest one.
Yeah, they really value it and sometimes almost like demand loyalty. Yeah, because to be like disloyal or seen as disloyal to Leo can be one of the biggest, things that can put you on the bad list for a Leo. Yeah. What do you think about that, Jo?
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad you brought that up. Loyalty as a very core Leo characteristic. It makes me think of some other Leo characteristics, such as sincerity or a very genuine quality, or even honesty. As of course, there's not always like pure honesty when it comes to, especially when we're talking about politicians, obviously. But there is kind of like an earnestness that can come along with Leo, and a generosity of heart as well. I think of terms like open-hearted when I think of Leo and their best qualities. We talked a little bit about the shadow stuff, but I think Leo placements can be very, very loyal, and in their earnestness can expect that from others, and at least hope and wish for that from others. Because why wouldn't you? When you are open-hearted, when there is that trust. I do agree that trust being broken is like a huge, it's heartbreaking, speaking of the heart and Leo. But it's a huge burn to a Leo. And I think that's super important for this sign of the sun that is about this kind of, this almost kind of transparency and honesty. Those are some of the other related things I think about when it comes to loyalty.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, and I love the word you use, earnestness, because that's so Leo. Right or wrong, there's a sort of it comes down to that childlike thing. I think of Leos as being kind of gullible. They're not. If they're cynical, it's because life made them that way, and not it's not innate. There's not sort of like an innate not like you Scorpios, we're not born just like sort of suspecting everyone.
With like born with like a switchblade, like in
exactly,
hand, like right out of the uterus.
Yeah, no, there's a sort of childlike presumption, like, hey, I'm going to love everyone and everyone's going to love me. And, I mean, of course, life eventually sorts that out. But
one of the funniest significations I laughed at when I did a poll like I've done for these episodes on Twitter of like what keywords you associate. One of the funniest ones I laughed at that somebody gave was golden retriever for Leo. That was
I saw that and I was like, God damn it.
Yeah. That's
I hate
really
it because it's kind of true. Like there's an exuberance and I mean, I have Jupiter in Leo also. So like this is coming from my own bias, but like I've always had that kind of like undying optimism somehow, like also with angular Saturn. I don't understand how it works, but yeah, there is this exuberance and like people
eager to please,
eager to please. Yeah. Like just like dogs are so loyal as well, and they're just dogs aren't like hiding anything or censoring anything. Like there's that pure life force just like radiating out, and there is something very leonine about it.
Yeah. I know.
Just like you big, dumb, beautiful animal. Like Leos are kind of like the himbos of the zodiac.
We're going to start a world war between all Leos and all Scorpios.
All Scorpios, okay.
I'm taking it as a compliment. And it makes me think of, I know like Virgo is a different episode, but I think about the qualities of Leo and sort of the corrective function of Virgo to Leo. And I think about Virgo as like modulating or like editing a little bit of that. And, of course I do. I have 3 Virgo placements to go along with my 2 Leo placements.
3 Virgo placements? You call those Virgo?
Oh, no.
Sorry.
Hey, we both have Venus in Virgo, so we can gel on that.
Astrologers have stellium measuring contests. Like that's the new thing. I didn't realize that was a thing, but now, okay. Keep it in your
Leo's gonna Leo.
Pants.
Leo's gonna Leo.
Yeah. All right. We'll keep it in your pants for this episode, and then that's great. The modulating quality, because it's good to start bringing that contrast, which is like when we switch to Virgo and you get that corrective function or feature of that sign. One of the things is it's much more like analytical and a little bit like intellectual and almost overly focused on the intellect, but also there's like a humbling that happens. Like suddenly you get way more humble when it comes to Virgo. And that's another thing that can happen is sometimes this corrective function can almost like overdo it compared to the previous sign. And I think that's part of the major contrast between Leo and Virgo is sometimes, Leo can be more self-centered or more egotistical in some ways. And then Virgo can take it the opposite direction and be almost like self-sacrificing or just overly helpful or overly trying to be sort of like an assistant to somebody else in some sense.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
No, you go ahead.
What were you going to say, Jo?
I was going to say, thinking of Leo and Virgo together and contrasting them, there's this idea of what was expressed what was expressed in Leo. Moving into Virgo, it's like, okay, but how is it useful? But what is its function? And, that too can go way too far because Leo, again, counterbalances Virgo by saying it's useful because it's authentic. It is expression, like it's life force. It's the creative force that we all have, and we all have a right to put forth into the world. And arguably that's an important thing for each and every one of us to put into the world. But, a little bit of curating or editing or optimizing is a good thing with Leo and Virgo together. But it's interesting to think about it going both ways, not just from Leo to Virgo, but also how does Leo counterbalance that overly analytical kind of analysis paralysis thing that Virgo can do.
Mm.
Yeah, for sure. That makes sense. That made me, for some reason, think of gold. Like gold is actually a major sun, but also like Leo thing. And just the notion of gold, or sometimes like liking to decorate in gold or liking golden things. That was one of the funny, like weirdly like stereotypical things about Trump when he was president, and just looking at his biographies, like he liked to like decorate everything with gold. And that was like one of his things.
Gold toilet. I mean,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, and So that's an interesting thing. So we haven't mentioned that as the contrast. So it's like we had Obama and some of those versions of Leo with Obama with his stellium, that interesting contrast of the Aquarius rising with Obama and Saturn and Capricorn, but then that huge like Leo stellium over in the 7th house, and early on they called him cool-headed Obama or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember when he debated John McCain, and the next night Jon Stewart put up a picture of Obama? It made him look like he was like on the cover of a soul hits record album. Like he was so just, and meanwhile McCain was like wandering back and forth, not knowing where the camera was and all that.
Okay.
Yeah. Obama, I mean, when I think of Obama, and the first time I saw him, it reminds me of the first time I saw Clinton. I saw Obama when in 2004, he gave a speech at the Democratic Convention, and that people immediately zeroed in on him on his charisma and his speaking skills. And next thing you knew, he was winning all these primaries and on his way to become president. So it was, I mean, he really sort of came out of the blue, and it was really in that same way that I remember seeing Clinton, where just out of the blue he appeared on TV, and it was just. Everyone knew instantly, oh, this should be the dude,
Yeah. And then it was like Obama also had the, I think like a Mercury Neptune square. And there were some of the questions about like early on his promises, or like what he wanted to accomplish, and sort of what the platform that he rose into the office with versus what he was actually able to accomplish once he got into office, sometimes falling short of some of those promises. And there was so many interesting contrasts then leading into the Trump presidency. And so if we could talk a little bit about some of the positives and some of the negatives, because I felt like we got a weirdly stark, like not stark, but crash course in some Leo significations, and like some positive, like stereotypical ones, and some negative stereotypical ones with Trump that were really interesting, that might be worth just like mentioning here as part of this exploration. So one of them, I guess, was the focus, the sort of showiness, and sometimes which can lead into sort of like a vanity.
Telling everyone that, the stakes you make are the greatest stakes. The university you make is the greatest university. The buildings you build is the greatest building. I mean, that's
so everything is like the greatest, or like you put your name on everything, and that your name itself becomes like the branding.
Yeah.
So what is it? It's like a sort of egotisticalness or something, or because there's different ways to do that probably would work. And in some ways that did work for him. And he became very successful financially and as a businessman with that. And there's probably I'm trying to think of like other versions of that. Because sometimes it can come off as like kind of like gaudy, if that's the right word, versus I'm trying to think of other versions of that appear less like that, or more sort of culturally somehow passable in some way.
Yeah. I mean, the gaudiness, I think, is part of it. Not unlike Napoleon crowning himself, that same kind of thing, like just really going over the top with whatever you're presenting. There's an excess that can easily be reached.
So maybe self-aggrandizing can be one of the keywords.
Yeah, self-aggrandizing was the exact term I was thinking of. Like something about this centrality of selfhood and authenticity that's important, but just like overblowing it to where you expect everyone to get in your orbit, when really, like, surely that, there are people in your life that are kind of in your orbit, and there are, the self is an important reference point, but no one's like the most important person in the world by any means. And it's interesting thinking too about what you were saying, Chris, the same sort of theme being somehow like acceptable, or like not being as gaudy. And, you mentioned Jackie O, but like fashion icon, you know what I mean? Like you can be iconic while also being tasteful. And it's like, it's again, this idea of excessiveness or excess versus like, is it modulated? Is there enough self-awareness to be able to have the charisma and direct it, and use it and utilize it, like we saw from someone like Obama or many other Leo examples. I think Beyonce in your Leo examples.
Isn't she a
Chris?
Virgo?
I think Mars and Leo.
Mars and Leo. I was going to say, I think there's a Leo placement at least, or like Whitney Houston. But yeah, it's like how. There you go.
I mean, I've been waiting to pull her out, but
Leo. Or the other one that goes with what you're saying, Joe, is Kanye West, who has Saturn and Leo. And I keep thinking we don't have a birth time for Obama. It's like there's different conflicting.
You mean Kanye? For
Kanye, yeah. There's many different conflicting times, so people shouldn't rely on the ones that are currently circulating. But I strongly suspect that Saturn is playing a more prominent role in his chart if we knew what his birth time was, either because he's like Leo rising or because he has Saturn like ruling the ascendant or like something like that. Cause like that's his only Leo placement, but that one Leo placement is doing like a lot of work in his chart with some of those things that we were just talking about, where he's a great example of someone who on the one hand is incredibly just like ridiculously talented as an artist and as a creative person, and has like risen to such a high level of fame and acclaim because of that, and because of his skills and an ability to also not just create art, but also to like identify good art himself and to like curate or pull some of the best pieces from it. Because Kanye originally, came up as a producer and sometimes of making beats, but also going back and seeing, taking old songs or clips from songs and like sampling them and then creating these amazing beats, based on that. So there's something also with Leo or some level of creatives about not just creating something nice, but also being able to recognize and identify something that is aesthetically pleasing at the same time.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. And this might be veering. If we still want to talk about examples, we can and should. But it makes me think of this idea of Leos being like the best hype people imaginable. Like if you need someone to gas you up, find a Leo who loves you to do it. Right. And there's this idea of not only being able to attract attention, but also to direct it. And I believe it's in the first decan of Leo that Austin talks a lot about this in 36 Faces, which I was just reading those parts recently. But yeah, there's this ability to...
You have the book. You're one of... that's kind of like a... What's the word for that? Like you're kind of just dropping that in the middle that you happen
just,
to own.
A little humble brag.
Right, exactly. Because like
it's just, it's just over there on my couch, whatever.
You have like 3 copies?
Yeah, just, casually, just in case.
Nobody has copies of the book because it's been out of print forever. And Austin is really taking his sweet time getting version 2 out, but it'll be out soon, I am told. So there you go ahead.
That was really it. Just this idea of being able to direct the spotlight and direct attention rather than just gather it or absorb it or, inflate because of it. And we see that with Kanye being able to like really recognize talent and sort of transfer the spotlight to these people who then there's this idea of like, oh, Kanye said they were good. So like we should pay attention. And then we see like authority coming through or like kind of leadership qualities there, these other kind of Leo aspects, but being able to direct attention, not just absorb it, is something I think about a lot.
I love that. That's brilliant. Like the delegation of the spotlight, the ability to delegate the spotlight and point it in different directions, like the Nicki Minaj verse on Monster in his like 2010 album, and how he featured her there. And that really just like made her entire career at that point in some ways. And had her sort of like allowed her in some ways to outshine him on his own song. I don't know personally, actually, not knowing him, if he was like super stoked about that or if that was like okay with him, but that's kind of what happened. And it was something he's been good at during the course of his career.
I think a classic example is when he went and during one of those award shows, and Taylor Swift had just been awarded an award, and he went on stage and snatched the mic from her and said Beyonce should have won or something like that. I mean, talk about advocating for people. That's
well, that's a great example, because what he was trying to do in his like semi-drunken state was like point the spotlight as his friend Beyonce, who he felt like was being unfairly, not given the award for having what he considered to be the better music video, and then it was given to Taylor Swift. And so he was trying to like redirect the spotlight from Taylor onto his friend. Although ironically, I think that was one of the things that led to, because he also viewed that, I think personally, as an act of like loyalty to his friends, to Beyonce and to Jay-Z. And ironically, that was part of the beginning of the like falling out for several years, I think, between him and that couple was they didn't like appreciate it, and he didn't appreciate that his act of like loyalty to them wasn't returned in kind, or wasn't appreciated in some ways.
Right. I should look at the transits for when that happened, but but it just it called to mind after everything Joe was saying. I was thinking like, well, that really did the trick.
So here's Kanye's noon chart. So the houses and the ascendant are not necessarily correct, but there's that Saturn at 12 degrees of Leo. And it's interesting. It's squaring Uranus at 8 degrees of Scorpio. As well as sextile Jupiter,
6
Jupiter
degrees.
14.
Is it 8? Oh, sorry. My eyes are failing me. Sorry.
Yeah. And Saturn's at 12 Leo, and it's sextiling also Jupiter at 14 Gemini. There's other things there, though, with Kanye in the Leo example, because it's like Saturn in Leo, where Saturn has its detriment or its antithesis or exile. So it struggles a little bit more to do well because it's in a foreign position there. And this is something that it seems like Kanye struggles with, where on the one hand, he has been able to become very successful and become a central figure in like culturally over the course of the past decade or two. But then at the same time, sometimes he like goes too far, or sometimes his self-aggrandizing tendencies get the best of him. And
just a little bit ridiculous. It looks just a little bit ridiculous sometimes.
A little bit over the top sometimes, a little bit like there's some keywords there. It's not like flamboyant, but there's other versions of that, like extravagance. Like extravagance is a good Leo keyword, I feel like.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of other things we can say about Kanye, about Trump. Why don't we start moving on? One of the things I like to do is to contrast. We've done a good job so far of contrasting like Leo and Cancer a little bit, Leo and Virgo. We might want to move into contrasting it with some of the other signs. One of the ones that we've started to do a little bit was Leo versus Aquarius. And that might be something that we could get a little bit more mileage out of. I know we've done a little bit already, but so Aquarius is also a fixed sign. It's an air sign. So it's an air sign. In ancient, the Stoic qualities and like Vedius Valency associate air with coldness or air with a cooling property. So that was supposed to contrast Aquarius, which is right in the middle of winter, the winter season in the northern hemisphere, with Leo, which is right in the middle of the summer. So this notion of like cold being opposite to hot, and also Saturn being the furthest and slowest and dimmest of the visible planets, being the traditional ruler of Aquarius, being opposite to the sun ruling Leo. What are some of the ways, or what are some of the keywords with Aquarius that kind of like contrast with the keywords for Leo?
Detached, because Leo is not detached.
Right.
It might pretend sometimes on a front, but yeah.
So Camille wrote down some ones, or did you have something, Joe?
Oh, I was just going to say it's hard for me to think of the contrast between Leo and Aquarius without thinking of the contrast between the Sun and Saturn, and the Sun having so much to do with selfhood and those kinds of things and identity, with Saturn being just not concerned with those things, much less concerned about the self and more concerned with what is sustainable, things like longevity. I imagine like the king in the center of the capital or the city, and then like the hermit that lives like out on the mountaintop being Saturn, just like reading old texts all day and like meditating. There are very, very opposite priorities when it comes to the Sun and Saturn, and I think we see that reflected as it trickles down into the signs they rule. So those are things I think about a lot with Leo and Aquarius.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, and by extension of that, the sort of the childlike quality I was mentioning with Leo that extends through adulthood is sort of in reverse with Aquarians who are, born at 80.
Right. Yeah, I like that as with my Aquarius rising. And one of the things though is that it's complementary, those opposites. It's one of the important things in the zodiac to remember, and it's really insightful, and that you actually see come up in charts or in your actual life, which is me having that Aquarius rising with Saturn ruling the ascendant and everything, that I just like attract Leo risings, and many of my closest friends have always been Leo rising, including the two of you. So with the ascendants being opposites, sometimes that old cliche notion of opposites attract is sort of true, because it creates like a wholeness when you take two halves or two halves or sides of the same coin.
For sure. Speaking as someone who not only has the ascendant opposite your ascendant, but my sun is opposite your moon. My moon is opposite your sun. So we've always had that polarity going with us.
Yeah. And what's interesting right now is my partner has Aquarius rising as well, but is a Leo. So like he really has both of those things present in his chart very prominently. So it's interesting to see that contrast in lived experience, like right in front of me all the time. And it can feel very it can be kind of like a torn in two type of feeling sometimes when you have that contrast present in natal charts. But yeah, I'm getting to see a lot of ways that Leo Aquarius axis plays out just in everyday life with that. So.
Yeah, that's like, Obama's chart was like that with Aquarius rising and the sun in Leo, or even it makes me also think of Carl Jung, who had Aquarius rising with Saturn in Aquarius and the sun and Uranus in Leo in the 7th.
Yeah, and I think with Aquarius, there's this kind of like bird's eye view idea, this like Saturnian perspective, this broadening, where with Leo, we really get this understanding like from the inside out. That's something I think about too, because you said detached, and that makes me think of the word distance, where there is more perspective. There's more perspective of where one individual fits into the whole with Aquarius, where you are in that, like you're very in that perspective with Leo, viewing it from the inside rather than like from the outside.
Sure.
Yeah.
Although I would modify that only slightly to say that Leo is also a big picture sign, but like you're saying, sort of the reverse. Like they're both big picture signs, as opposed to like Virgo. When we were, just to go back for a second, the corrective of Virgo and Leo. Virgo's into all the little details, whereas Leo just wants sort of like the big picture, if you will. But I agree. It's not a detached big picture. It's a very sort of it's a perspective big picture, whereas indeed Aquarius is about like the totality of things, the real sort of wholeness of things.
I like that idea also of like insider versus outsider, and Leo being more insider because it's at the center of things, versus Saturn and Aquarius is more that which is outside, or that which is on the fringes, or like the periphery of things, or the periphery of society. Camille Michelle Gray had written down some contrasts that I thought were very good for Leo and Aquarius. And let me see if I can share some of those really quickly here. Here it is. So Leo as me versus Aquarius as us. Leo as warm during the summer versus Aquarius as cool during the winter. Presence versus distance. The cheerleader versus the misfit. Spontaneity versus rigid. Saturn is very rigid. Sun, Saturn, subjective, objective. Emotive versus aloof. To trust or forgive versus to question, or you might even say to reject. Charisma versus like kind of like awkwardness. Status versus outcast. Center of attention versus groups. The showman versus the intellectual, since Aquarius is an air sign, which tend to be more intellectual or more talkative. To be the light versus to enlighten. To perform versus to inform. Thinking versus being. King and queen versus the kingdom.
That's brilliant. That's very well done.
Yeah, I thought those are some really good contrasts that she came up with. And it really starts to, sometimes it's only through contrasting a sign with those other signs that you really start to get a much clearer picture of things. Absolutely.
These axes are always the main thrust in everything. One sign is not one way unless the other sign is the other way. It's what defines them.
in order to have one thing, you have to have its opposite, or in order to, it's not usually framed in this way of good or bad, but in order to have good, there has to be bad to contrast it with, was like an ancient like Stoic conceptualization for being able to even make distinctions like that, as being able to contrast things.
Right. Indeed.
All right. So, you have something, Joe?
Oh, it just kind of seemed a little bit related or mildly related. This idea that when you have a very bright light, like it casts these very strong shadows too. And I think about that with Leo. I know one of the ways the 3 fire signs are differentiated, and I believe this is in Camille's notes as well. And I know it was something I learned very early on in my studies. This idea of Aries being like a firecracker, being a cardinal fire sign, Sagittarius being the mutable fire sign, and like to a wildfire or like fire that spreads, and Leo being like a bonfire or a hearth fire. So there's this idea again of centrality, of fixity. But when I think about Saturn and Aquarius, like being on the very edge of where the light reaches, if you're thinking about like a bonfire at night in a field or something like that, and all the shadow that's also created by all that light, it's kind of hearkening back to these ideas of arrogance or hubris or some of those shadow things we discussed with Leo. But
hubris is a good keyword.
Seems very Regulus related to thinking back to what Nick was saying. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So I'm glad we're doing this. So we're getting into the contrast of the 3 fire signs and the fiery triplicity of the difference between Aries, which is ruled by Mars and is a cardinal sign. And you said a firecracker, and I like that because a firecracker is something that, like, you know, comes in fast out of nowhere, and there's just sudden explosion or sudden fire and a pop and a loud bang, but then it immediately like goes away and it doesn't last. It's not lasting in some sense, but it can still make a big difference in that initial instance in which it explodes, or in which there is like an initial explosion in some sense.
Yeah, I guess the only other one I would sort of throw in for Aries is the idea of lighting a match, you know, which is often used as a sort of metaphor for any kind of like igniting something, you know, just that strike and the sense that you're beginning something with that strike of a match is an image we use a lot in culture.
Yeah. So the person that lights the match and walks away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And, you know, thinking about Aries and Leo too, thinking back to the beginning of this episode, the one-upping concept with Leo, I think with fire signs, there's kind of a competitive spirit in general, or there can be. But I think more so with Aries being ruled by Mars rather than the sun. And this is, of course, biased because it's through, you know, the lens of my personal experience. But I've never been very competitive. I actually really hate competition. But it doesn't mean I don't like being the best at things, or there's not a sense of striving. But I think we can look at Mars's rulership of Aries versus the sun's rulership of Leo, and we can see kind of a fighting spirit with both. But it can be, we really see selfhood and authenticity anchored with Leo, to where it's like, I want to be my best self. I want to be better than I was yesterday, or what have you, versus I want to be better than you, or like I've singled you out or like targeted you as my opponent, which is a very kind of martial quality and feels even more cardinal as well, contrasting those 2 fire signs. So that's something to think about.
One of the phrases that goes to what you're saying with Leo here, I think, is when we say that person has heart, or they're like, you've got a heart, kid, you know, like that phrase, like what I think that's a very Leo type phrase in terms of what you're describing here.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
everything you do with your sort of fullest, you know, every fiber of your being, so to speak. That's all in. Say
it with your chest is another like very Leo way of behaving.
Or as I've explained to friends at times, or in my apologies, anything I do, I overdo.
Yeah.
Yeah. And encourage as another good one then is like sort of related to that in terms of having heart or something like that, versus, more of a combative impulse, like the impulse to win over somebody else that comes with Mars and Aries to some extent. Okay. So, and then what is the contrast? So we're contrasting that short, like lighting the match or lighting the bomb and then walking away with Aries with the fixed fieriness of Leo, and using that metaphor more of like a bonfire, which is something that, you light it, it might take a while to like start. Like fixed signs are notoriously slow to get going. They have a hard time initiating things, but once started, they sort of stay in place and they have this sense of stability and permanence and something that lasts for quite a while, which can sometimes mean they can be kind of fixed in their ways or have a resistance to change in some sense. Can be another fixed sign quality that we saw, especially in Taurus. It was major in Taurus, but that can kind of be a Leo thing as well.
Yeah, definitely. And, thinking about like the bonfire analogy too, I think about how, it may take a while to get started, but like once that thing's going, like good luck getting the embers to go out for days and days, even if it's not roaring anymore. But there's also this idea of the fire needing to be fed. And I think we see that with this desire for recognition and sometimes validation with Leo. This idea that like
fire going.
To keep the fire going, it needs fuel. And with Sagittarius, if we're sticking with these like very literal fire analogies, the fire just moves. The fire just finds fuel and explores. And there's this very mutable, exploratory kind of quality with Sagittarius that is different than Leo. Like Leo would rather provide the warmth and draw things to it rather than go outward and seek. Because change can be very uncomfortable for fixed signs. Even the fixed fire signs can confirm. Love to have Uranus squaring all my Leo planets right now. But yeah, that's another kind of contrast I think about with these fire signs is the outward moving, very, very variety and option oriented feeling of Sagittarius as a fire sign.
Yeah, no, that's very well put. Yeah.
Yeah, and fire rises upwards. Like that's one of its qualities in ancient cosmology, that fire was said to rise up to the highest position in the cosmos. And so you get that quality with all of the fire signs, but in particular Leo, of just like wanting to rise to the top of something or be at the top of something. So with Sagittarius being Jupiter ruled, there is though much more of an expansive, maybe far-seeing or far-reaching quality that comes with that as a contrast, maybe a little bit more compared to Leo.
Yeah, Jupiter's supposed to be sort of infinite, really. It's takes a Saturn transit to stop it. Otherwise, it just keeps going.
Right. Well, that's funny because Saturn transits don't affect Leos, is what I've heard.
That's not true.
That's not.
No, it's
not.
Are you
kidding me? Are you?
Well, that's
kidding
what's
me?
funny is actually I think Saturn transits may be the hardest for Leos because one of the things that Saturn brings is age and time and the notion that
and humility.
Humility,
it's suddenly not about you,
right? Yeah, or that you are like a fixed or a finite resource, or and sometimes that ties into some of the other things with like vanity and things like that, like age and being a limiting and a humbling factor, but also something that can change so that you're not always going to be, the notion that you might not always be as good as you were earlier, and some of that longingness for the youthful quality when the fire was still like burning at its brightest or something like that, that is something that's interesting sometimes with Leos and Saturn transits.
It's so unambiguous in my life that the worst times were when Saturn was in Leo and they initiated, sort of longer term bad times, and that the greatest times of my life have been Saturn in Aquarius. In fact, I'm personally campaigning for Saturn to never leave Aquarius ever. Just stay there.
Oh my God.
Just stay. No. Stop moving.
I'd like a small break. Please.
Small break. We've got just until March. Saturn goes into Pisces, and I'm throwing a big party.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's good. Is there anything else we should say about the contrast between those two fire signs of Saturn, of Leo and Sagittarius, or even of all of the fire signs that this really brings up to help us clarify some of the meanings of Leo?
I think Joe did it beautifully. I don't have much to add. I mean, I can only think of more sort of like personal examples, but I think she just, she nailed it. There's no need to.
Can you think of any chart examples of people that have, like, let's say, Leo and Sagittarius placements?
I think one of the great sort of team of Leo and Sagittarius that I think of is Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, who are, they really complete each other. Mick Jagger being the Leo, just, the Mr. sort of show off rock star extraordinaire. And then Keith Richards being this sort of, almost mystical figure. I mean, the biggest meme in the world is the fact that he's like so old, but just keeps going, right? I mean, those are all those jokes. You see, there's like a picture of him teaching a little boy guitar, and it's like, this is Keith Richards teaching Willie Nelson how to play guitar, jokes like that. There's all these, there's another one I saw, like a picture of rock stars when they were kids, and it's like, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, whoever, and they're all really little kids. And then there's a picture of Keith Richards, and he's like he is today, so it's like, that's the
forever young, or like forever youthful, exactly. But also really grasping onto the youth in some ways and not letting it go.
Well, yeah, there was even a politician, I forget who died about 10 years ago. And the dying words of this man was, "I can't believe Keith Richards is going to outlive me." Like, imagine those are your last words on earth. But yeah, that's sort of, he does seem to have this sort of, mystical streak in him. It's strange. And yeah, just his sort of, his approach to music, his counterbalance to the Mick Jagger, the way they sort of form this unit, I think really embodies that Leo Sagittarius teamwork very well.
Yeah. It brings Leo Sagittarius combinations bring in optimism as well. I think that really helps out, like a boundless sort of optimism. And, yeah, because I was talking like a Sagittarius rising recently, and they were very much like into partially like the power of positive thinking and like the positive thinking of saying like yes to things and thinking optimistically, actually having an impact in like changing things and leading to better outcomes than the more Saturnian approach of thinking about the worst case scenario or thinking about how things could fall apart or something like that.
Very true.
I can't think of any kind of like celebrity Leo Sagittarius kind of synastry examples, but I will say, like, as a Leo with Leo rising, there's nothing like that fire synastry, like Sag risings or Sag moon or even Aries placements. Like, there's something so dynamic about that kind of synastry where it can just kind of build on itself and we can feed off each other. And it's some of the most fun I've had. I've been like at astrology conferences with like my fire synastry buddies. So there's something pretty magical about it.
Yeah, I would attest in life, so many of those special friendships. Yeah, for sure.
And one of the ones that's really funny like that actually is actually Donald Trump, who that wasn't there a phrase at one point of just like constantly winning, or of that, because like the power of like positive thinking is actually a really core thing for him that runs in his family, of that like you have to be like constantly winning, and being a winner is like super important. And he has that combination of the Leo rising and Mars in Leo, but also a full moon eclipse in Sagittarius at the same time. So he has a bit of that energy where focusing on that, like manifesting the optimism of the positive thinking, and sometimes just running purely on that is part of the program, I guess. Yeah.
Yep.
For better or worse. So, all right. So that's pretty good with the fire signs. What are some of the other contrasts? Are the modalities?
Yeah, the fixed thing is a big one.
Yeah. So contrasting the 4 fixed signs, which are Taurus. Let me make sure to share this. 4 fixed signs are Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. So we've talked already a lot about Leo and Aquarius. We've talked a little bit about Taurus, but maybe that's one we could spend a little bit more time on, since Leo is like the second fixed sign, and we were first introduced to the fixed energy with Taurus. And arguably, I think Taurus is like the most fixed of the fixed signs, because it's not just a fixed sign, but it's also an earth sign. And earth tends to fall down in the ancient like cosmological scheme. The element of earth falls down to the very bottom of the cosmos, where it rests and sort of stays fixed in place in some sense, as opposed to like water that moves around a bit on top of earth, or air that moves around more, or fire that rises like all the way up to the top of the cosmos.
Yeah, earth has a density to it, you know, and you just sort of, you think of Taurus as having a density to it that is not quite equaled by the other fixed signs.
Mm. So Leo, by contrast, is a little bit less fixed because it's fire. It's like a fiery sign, so it has a little bit more flexibility to some extent. But I think they do share some things in common in terms of like routines potentially, or once they find something that they like, potentially, that they like really like that thing, perhaps, or having very defined likes and dislikes might be something that Taurus and Leo share in common.
Yeah, it's hard for me I have a Taurus moon, so it's sometimes hard for me to sort of split that nut down the middle, if you will. But I'm definitely very particular in my taste, whether it's my Taurus moon or my Leo stellium.
Yeah, being particular in their tastes. That's a good one.
Yeah, I think about fixed signs with the concept of like the phrase, as long as I have X, I'll be okay, or something. This idea of like, as long as this doesn't change, like I've got this down, like I'll be fine. And with Taurus being an earth sign, I think about this focus on the material or physical world. So it's like, as long as I have a roof over my head, or like this material security, or like my creature comforts, you know, what have you, I'll be okay. And with Leo...
My sensual pleasures. I'm sorry, I just wanted to interject. My sensual pleasures.
Sensual or
exactly.
like sensible things, sensible things, yeah.
Yeah, that very sense-based
like
kind
food.
Of stuff. Yeah, like food.
Right.
Like food, or your cozy blanket,
or even just
your cozy spot.
the feeling of fabric, or the feeling of skin, you know, it's all that stuff.
Yeah. And with Leo, I think about the element of fire and how it's related to spirit, you know, rising the highest. And with Leo, I suppose the phrase might be something like, as long as I have myself, I'll be okay. Or like, I'll be okay. As long as I know who I am and I can stay true to that. There can
as long as I have my friends.
Right. And who are your friends, but people who can see you for who you really are and really understand you and like feed that fire. And I suppose we could do that with all the fixed signs, but there is something, and I think this was in Camille's notes as well, and I really liked this. The thing that the fixed fire sign wants to keep fixed or maintain is identity, which we're kind of back where we started with these sun words and these Leo words. But there's this idea that as long as you can be true to yourself, like you can make it through anything, versus like, as long as I have like my stuff, or like the stuff I like or need, I have my needs met with that fixed earth sign with Taurus.
Yeah, I was thinking of the phrase, as long as I have my makeup, for Leo would be like a good Leo.
that's yeah.
That was the first thing that came to mind, but that's part of, you know, sometimes people's sense of identity and like presentation and things like that. Or are there other versions of that? Like, as long as I have my X,
fabulousness.
My fabulousness, my sense of style, like my, you know, presentation, as long as, or an artist maybe might say, as long as I can do my art, as long as I can, you know, continue doing my painting or what have you, then whatever.
Right. That outlet for expression.
Right.
It's interesting that you bring up makeup though, because, you know, me being a cringy Leo, I did beauty blogging for a while. And for me, it was kind of like a creative outlet with just like kind of using like myself as a canvas. But the whole reason I got into it is because I wanted to kind of teach people how to use makeup, because there's this idea of makeup kind of augmenting the way you look, or giving you the opportunity to curate what you look like outwardly to match how you feel inwardly. And I was really interested in how I could help to give people the tools to do that, or make it seem more accessible if it seemed complicated. And I eventually stopped. It was like right when Instagram influencer culture was getting big, and I just like wasn't interested in any of that. I wanted to make tutorials. But that's, you brought up makeup, and I thought about that as even a way to curate the appearance as a form of creative expression and as a way to potentially really boost that authenticity and have a feeling of coherence between inner and outer and what is shared or what is performed.
I think there's a blanket statement I can take from what both of you are saying is I think, there's a value in one's own good taste, which has to do with the self-presentation. But like, indeed, like, if it's the makeup, it's like, your presentation has value. Or if you're an artist, like Chris was saying, it's like what you're contributing to art has this value, is good. So yeah, there's this just sort of larger tent over all of this, which is, the value of this, again, this sort of the solar choices, like my decision to match Joe in outfit today, that kind of thing,
I mean, I wore a different shirt today too. I'm wearing a gray shirt today. If anybody didn't notice, I thought I'd get a little wild and get a little flamboyant for this episode.
Otherwise known as the Scorpio uniform. Yeah, we get it.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna go back to black for the next 300 episodes, but I thought I would do something special today.
All right. Well, thanks for lightening up the Leo episode, Chris.
Thank you. I do what I can. Having 0 planets in Leo, just my descendant. So I import Leos into my life to play that out. So I have both of you wearing the red t-shirts today. Yeah. So I like what you're saying, Joe. So I was writing down, so the ability to curate and to shape one's presentation as being an important part of Leo. That seems really central or really critical here because it touches on a few things that we've gone through during the course of this discussion. Yeah. All right. So that's Taurus. Is there anything else with Taurus versus Leo contrasts that are either sort of like similarities or contrasts between the two of them? Taurus being it's more, Taurus was more about, we were talking about like sensual or physical pleasures, like food or comforts or things of enjoyment and things like that. And we get some of that with Leo of things of enjoyment, but having enjoyment more through expression and through the process of creation and things like that. It seems like, and through emitting something into the world.
I feel like there could be kind of a connection, like a glamour and luxury thing with both Taurus and Leo. And I thought about this when I was writing moon sign compatibility for the Cusp app last year. Because, Taurus is a Venusian sign, and there is this idea around luxury and, beauty and even glamour. But it gets filtered through more of like a performative or expressive lens with Leo versus like an experiential lens with Taurus. And I think we see fire and earth there as well, with fire being something that illuminates or lights up or shines out, and Taurus being something that is really experienced through the senses. But I do think we can see kind of a resonance there with those things.
Yeah, of a focus on like aesthetics and aesthetics qualities being important.
Right.
All right, so that's Taurus and Leo. And then moving on to the last one we haven't talked about too much, aside from some jokes, which was Leo and Scorpio as both fixed signs. Leo is a fixed fire sign. Scorpio, on the other hand, is a fixed water sign. So what are some of the contrasts then that come up? A fixed water sign that's ruled by Mars. So it's a Marsy sign, but it's like the more internalized version of the two Mars signs compared to Aries, which is like the extroverted Mars sign. Scorpio is like the introverted Mars sign.
Yeah, this is a tough one. I mean, out of the four, like I can see Leo Aquarius, that's easy, and yeah, everything Joe was just saying about Leo and Taurus really stands up. But Scorpio's a little stranger, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's like fixed water. One of the best ones I heard.
Ice,
I don't know where. Ice, the ice cube. Like I've never. There's a great analogy for water. I don't know where I first heard that, but
you know what happens to ice cubes next to bonfires?
You put them in a nice drink and then it becomes a fun,
That's right. Yes.
relaxing party or something.
Sure.
Just a cocktail.
That's what Scorpios are good for, keeping the iced tea nice and chill.
No, well, that's a really good point.
Sorry,
is that the Leos are good
I'm a
for
dead man.
warming up the ice cube, I think, because Leo can drag out a more introverted sign like a Scorpio or even a Taurus to some extent that might want to just stay home and relax. Like Leo's the one that might want to drag out their friends in order to be more social or have fun or to build connections and sort of warm things up. And that's part of the contrast that makes them get along, even though there's a natural tension there. But through that tension, it creates something that's kind of productive.
I think one thing that I think both Scorpios and Leos share is that going back to that sense of loyalty. There's this this particularized, you got to be loyal to this. There's a stand to take. You're either on my team or you're not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm really glad. Oh, go ahead.
No. I mean that this is just sort of I'm thinking out loud here. Go ahead.
I was just going to say I'm really glad you brought that up because that was the very next thing I was going to bring up. As far as commonalities, there's this idea of this loyalty, and because Scorpio, being a water sign, it is a little bit more introverted rather than expressive or outward moving. So there's this idea of privacy, and there's also this idea of an inner circle. And if I have your back, you better have my back. And there's more of a martial tone to it. But yeah, all that to say, I totally agree with you, Nick. Very well said.
What you're talking about, it makes me think of the king or the president versus their assassin or their spies that they send out, and the need for the loyalty and the trust component. But but that also that Marsy component for Scorpio.
Yeah. And, we compared a little bit of Aries and Leo and this kind of very forthright, competitive Aries nature versus this, I want to be better than my past self kind of idea with Leo. And we have another Mars ruled sign traditionally with Scorpio, but it's much more strategic. And so there, I think, is also this commonality between them, or this resonance with this drive that's very comes from a very deep place. Whereas Scorpio might not be quite as forthright about it compared to a fire sign, but there's this deep drive. And I think about Scorpio too as if we were going to use the little ad lib, as long as I have X, I'll be okay. With Scorpio, I feel it's as long as I have control, I'll be okay. Because it is a water sign. And there is this kind of feeling of needing to protect the emotional well-being and safety. But with Mars in charge, it's okay, I got to have all my shit on lock. And I have to keep all of it locked down and keep it just like this so I can feel okay. So that's something I think about too.
Yeah, I think Leo wants control, for control. I think Scorpio wants control for security. There's a real there's more of a motivation for wanting control with Scorpio as opposed to Leo just wants control. That's right. For its own sake,
Leo wants to lead and sort of be in charge and be at the forefront or the head of things, whereas Scorpio wants to protect itself and
make sure no one else can sort of overcome it,
Yeah. To ward off enemies or threats or something like that. Yeah. So I was trying to think of people with a Scorpio Leo contrasts. One of the ones that always comes to mind, even though we don't know her birth time famously, and there's multiple birth times, but Hillary Clinton has the Sun and Venus and Mercury in the South Node in Scorpio, and then Saturn and Pluto and Mars in Leo. So that's an interesting example of that. I think there's others that were born around her time frame, but I forget who they were at the moment. Do you remember, Austin, that have that same contrast?
Austin? My God. How dare you? Did you call me Austin?
Did I? Sorry. It's been
let me get my
my
tobacco a second. Hold on. No. Yeah. Am I wrong? Is Prince Charles not born the same time as Hillary Clinton? I think so.
No, you're right. He's a Leo rising with Sun in Scorpio.
Yeah, he's definitely a Scorpio. I'm thinking he's a 47 Scorpio. Or is he a 48 Scorpio? I might be wrong there. He might be a 48 Scorpio. I'm drawing a blank for some reason. I think I should, I think the Queen got married in 47, then he was born in 48.
Quick on the
draw.
Yeah,
he's 48. I'm sorry.
So
I was
Leo
confusing
rising, Sun in Scorpio.
Yeah, I was confusing his birth with the Queen's wedding, which was a year earlier. So, thankfully Britain can sleep safe knowing their Queen was a virgin until she got married. But other than that, he is still a Scorpio with a Leo rising, which is funny. Like he reminds me of another Scorpio British royal, which was King Edward the seventh.
Everybody knows about King Edward the Seventh.
He was the son of Queen Victoria. So like Charles, he went into old age and he's got one job, which is to replace his mother who never dies. Like Queen Victoria also lived very, very old. And so you just have this life of like, waiting to be king, and it never sort of, happened. I mean, with Edward, it did happen, but he was past his 60s and he was already in ill health. I don't know. It's just that sort of, like not being king, but waiting and literally spending a lifetime waiting to like do your job.
That's really funny. Well, yeah. Okay. So, that's Charles as well. And I always use him as an example of somebody with the ruler of the ascendant in the fourth house. In his instance, it's Leo rising with the sun ruling the ascendant and Scorpio in the fourth house. And he's literally, that's not the only thing he's doing, but certainly a big part of his biography is that he was going to become king once his mother died, but then his mother has now become like the longest reigning monarch in like world history. So that is a central thing in his biography, and where he could get to this point where it's possible that she could outlive him, in which case he would never become king. Which is kind of an interesting dynamic. It's a little interesting. You bring out that contrast, which I'd never thought about before. Of course, with Hillary Clinton, we had an instance where it was kind of like she was waiting to become president, or sort of like on the track to become president.
That's a great point. She's the Prince Charles of the USA.
Yeah, but then it never quite happened, and. But we don't know her birth time. One of the versions was Scorpio rising with the Leo stuff up in the 10th house, which is an interesting sort of inversion of the Prince Charles thing. But yeah, so all right, so that's pretty good. Are there any other things? So Scorpio is more emotional. One of the interesting contrasts with both Scorpio and Aquarius versus Leo, they're both ruled by malefics, by either like Mars or Saturn, and a tendency more for like the darker or more like goth or even like emo type tendencies with Scorpio and Aquarius versus Leo. Kind of like looks at that with a little bit of, I don't want to say disdain, but a little bit of like bewilderment in terms of the focus sometimes on like the darker side of life.
You need a little color in that, honey. You need some orange to go with all that black and
Yeah, need to like lighten up a little bit. I think Leo might say. Right. Yeah, so that's an interesting contrast there between those two as well, compared to Leo. That Leo has a more a lighter, not just aesthetic, both visually but also mentally in some sense.
If we're, Leos can do goth, but it's all cosplay. Like it's just like it's a night out, and then we go back to our shiny selves.
Yeah, that's basically what Halloween is, essentially. It's like one day a year. All right, so that's the contrast with the quadruplicities, the modalities. Are there any other contrasts that might be worth doing? There's just a few other signs that we haven't talked about. We talked about the similarities between the youthfulness to some extent between Gemini and Leo. Libra and Leo is one we haven't talked about, which is the other sextile. So Gemini is a sextile from Leo, and then Libra is the other sextile from Leo, and a similar focus, I want to say, on things like aesthetics or fashion. Like somebody recently asked me to do an episode on like astrology and fashion, and I don't actually know anybody that specializes in that offhand, so I couldn't say I could do that right away. But
I think I might know an astrologer who used to do beauty blogging.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that could be it, but I think of the Leo and Libra sort of dynamic as being very much more aesthetically focused as a pair of signs.
Yeah, and also people focused. I think like Gemini, Libra, Leo, unlike any of the other signs that come to mind, have a real sort of like there have to be other people. Like Leo needs an audience, Gemini needs someone to talk to, and Libra needs someone to look at. You know, it's sort of it's more of an imperative with those three signs than any of the others that come to mind.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. One thing I think about a lot is how with Libra rising charts, with whole sign houses, at least Leo is placed in the 11th. And there's this idea of the house that the sun rules in a chart being somehow central to selfhood and that kind of stuff, or the self-realization process. And so with Libra rising, with Libra being so prominent, like the house of groups and social dynamics and peers and allies is really highlighted. And then with Leo rising charts, we have Libra in the 3rd. So there's this other house that is sometimes other people related when it comes to like siblings, neighbors, people who feel like siblings, and just this idea of, community, and this idea of expression or speaking, communicating, those kinds of things. So there's this real strong like air, fire, social connection that I think those two signs have.
I'm like quickly trying to like search through my Libra rising examples for something to connect to what you're saying. And one of the funny ones I just found was a famous Libra rising with Saturn and Leo was Hitler, actually. So that's
just super social, together.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that. Do either of you have any Libra rising with Leo placements that come to mind thinking about that?
Bill Clinton.
Yeah. Bill Clinton was major. That's where his two stelliums are.
I mean, that's your poster boy right there for those two signs.
Let me find his chart. Could you expand on that while I'm looking for his chart?
Sure. Yeah. He's a Libra rising. He's got Mars and Neptune on the ascendant.
Yep, Venus and Libra. Too.
Venus there too. Yeah, Venus there too.
And Jupiter.
And Jupiter. Yeah. Yeah, you should get him on for your Libra episode, Chris.
Okay. Yeah, the Libra
I'm sure his schedule is wide open. Yeah. But yeah, he's quite the classic.
And how does that connect again? Just refresh me on what, Joe, you were just saying.
This idea of the 11th house being really highlighted by the sun's rulership of the 11th house in Libra rising charts. And with Bill Clinton's chart especially, you have, the sun in Leo as the ruler of the 11th. You have Venus in Libra as ruler of the 1st. So you have these really, really strong signatures with both. And then we see someone who is extremely charismatic, like the cool candidate, as you were saying, Nick. Just a all-around really likable person, like kind of giving off a feeling of being a very trustable person in some ways. But yeah, those signatures highlighted in those places is kind of speaks to some things I was talking about.
Yeah. All right. So that's pretty good for filling that out for Leo and Libra. Only other two signs we haven't talked about at all in this episode, and they're
Capricorn and Pisces.
Yeah, the signs that are in aversion to Leo, two of the other signs that are in aversion besides Cancer and Virgo, which are a little bit more connected because those are the signs that immediately like precede or follow after Leo. But with Capricorn and Pisces, we get ones that just have no aspect and that don't share any of the basic same qualities because, for example, Leo is a fixed fire sign ruled by the sun, and it's a masculine sign or diurnal sign, whereas Capricorn is a cardinal earth feminine or / nocturnal sign, or Pisces is a mutable water feminine / diurnal or nocturnal sign. So, how does Leo relate or not relate? I guess primarily not relate to, or what are the incongruities between Leo and Capricorn?
Well, I mean, what we were saying earlier about control with Leo and Scorpio, and I pointed out like Scorpio has a motivation of security, whereas Leo just has its own motivation for wanting the power, to wanting to be in charge. Capricorn has some of that too. Capricorn does want power, but it wants to sort of, Leo just presumes it. But with Capricorn, it's always about the battle. It's not about being on top of the mountain. It's about climbing the mountain to get to the top. But there is that still sort of the end, goal is quite similar. It's just sort of the means by which one sort of assumes that power and what that power sort of means. A Leo might be a monarch, an all-ruling dictator. Capricorn is sort of more of a president or prime minister, someone who's in charge, but it's less sort of for show and more for like to actually run things. Like actually sort of have things in operation and be in control of that, of their functionality.
Yeah. When you were speaking, I was thinking of this idea of like self-sovereignty and being beholden to only to oneself. And that's a very kind of Leo idea, a very solar idea. And when I think of Capricorn, I think of sort of a feeling of obligation or responsibility or duty to like a pre-existing structure that has perhaps proved its usefulness by its longevity, or has just outlived its usefulness. It could really go either way. But I think there's kind of that disconnect there where it's like, well, I'm responsible to this structure or thing or way of doing things because that's the tradition or that's the way it is. And then there's like this creative, self-directed impulse with Leo where it's like, no, I do it my way because like I am entitled to do that because I'm self-sovereign. I am like my own, I'm the noble in my own kingdom, that type of idea. So I think there's kind of that disconnect.
Yeah. I've always talked about Uranus when it travels through a sign, when it transits through a sign, that it perverts the values associated with that sign. And the last time Uranus was in Capricorn at the very end of the 80s and in the early 90s, the big sort of like pop culture was sort of taken over by the lower order, if you will. MTV was subverted. Suddenly, like the buzzword for culture in those days was DIY. It was literally uncool for a musician to be on a corporate label, which is like you're saying, that's what Capricorn typically would want. Like, of course you would want to be on a Capricorn label, but Uranus goes into Capricorn. And so, suddenly the whole thing is, things are supposed to be sort of homemade and deliberately unprofessional and that, without the gloss of sort of, officially sort of produced material. And I think that speaks to what you're talking about, Joe. Like that thing that Capricorn wants is the facade. It's a different facade than Leo, but I think they both have a need for a facade of some way. Leo's might be more sort of genuine in what it's, even when it is a facade. But with Capricorn, that's an issue as well.
One of the things the Capricorn versus Leo aversion makes me think of is I was watching this like interview recently with this billionaire Kevin O'Leary, who was like one of the guys that became famous from like the Shark Tank. Did you guys ever watch that show?
Yeah. I think he was Canadian. I've seen him around. Yeah. Yeah,
he was born in Montreal, so where you're from. So he was telling this story about how when he grew up, his mother like helped him get through college, and then like the day he graduated, she was like, "I have a present for you," and he was like, "What is it?" And she's like, "You're cut off now that you're graduated. You're no longer my like problem, and you have to learn how to swim and figure out how to get by on your own, and all financial support is cut off." And that she said he had a specific phrase where she said something like, "The dead bird under the nest never learns how to fly." And so he later,
thanks, Mom.
Yeah, thanks. It's very like Capricorn thing. And so he later eventually, after struggling a little bit, got into business and became successful and became like a billionaire, became like wildly successful, climbing up the like corporate ladder. And then he had a family, and then he decided when his kids were like 3 or 4 that he was going to do the same thing. And so he told this story about how he created a trust for them when they were 3 or 4 that would ensure that they were taken care of if something happened to them, if he and his wife like died or passed away before they finished college, but that as soon as they turned like 25 or something, the trust would no longer give any money and all financial support would be cut off. And so he told this story about how one day his son was like in college or was in high school, and he was kind of like not doing very well, and he was fucking around. And his son came to him one day and said, all my friends are going to get their trusts when they're like 20 or something like that. So when does mine, mature? When do I receive it? And he said, well, actually, if you never go to college, like you get no money. So you're going to be cut off financially in just a few years here. And then his son really was shaken up by that and like turned his life around, and then went to college, and then eventually became successful and is now working at like Tesla or something like that. So there's just something about that story that reminds me of the Capricorn Leo dynamic, because one of the things about Leo is it sometimes makes me think of like inheritance and like lineage, and like inheriting from a lineage or having like a famous background or like a wealthy background or something like that. And sometimes people or kids that grow up within that context of like having wealthy or famous parents or something like that, and them inheriting like a little bit of that in some way, or having it passed on to them in some sense through that fixity of the sign, versus Capricorn is much more like self-determined and like has to climb the ladder, has to do things the hard way, and sometimes has to fall and then like get back up and things like that, and suffer hardship in order to persevere and eventually become stronger. And yeah, so it makes me think about that dynamic, because it is not a comfortable dynamic at all between those two signs. And it could also, end spectacularly in failure. There's some scenario or version of that story where it doesn't go well, but in that instance, it went well. So sometimes it can still be productive, even if it's not easy, or even if it's harsh.
Yeah, it reminds me of what you were saying, Chris, about like this idea of the power of positive thinking. And with Capricorn, it's like the power of like hard work, or like putting in the hours or the grind or something like that, like the elbow grease.
Yeah, or the power of fear, the power of like fearing poverty and like abject failure or dying or something due to lack of material support and sustenance, and that can kind of motivate you a little bit to get your stuff together sometimes. Yeah.
I can attest, as someone married to a Capricorn, I've never seen a harder working human being in my life. It's insane.
Right.
Anyway.
So it's interesting, though, that being a motivating factor versus for Leo, it may be like fame or recognition being like a motivating factor, or let's say being recognized for one's inherent traits, one's inherent positive traits, that the Leo wants to be able to shine, but to be recognized and be sort of pointed out as like you're notable and you're special for something, for this, basically.
Right. And to be remembered and to leave a legacy, you mentioned the lineage and things like that. I think, and even in my client work, I've, particularly with 12th house work, but a lot of Leo kinds of deep questions are like, what kind of legacy will I leave? Like, what will I leave behind? How will I be remembered? And it's like that becomes the lineage that like other people kind of rise out of and things like that. So
I love that fixed fire and the legacy of passing on a flame or a torch that is never extinguished.
It's like the Olympic torch kind of thing.
Yeah. And then, so family legacies. And then with Leo, family legacies can sometimes be like a positive thing. There can be like positive versions of that, or there can be like, negative versions of that as well, where there's like bad things passed on as part of that family lineage or family legacy.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
All right. The very last contrast that we haven't done yet is Leo versus Pisces. So Pisces is a water sign, mutable and feminine, or nocturnal. What are some of the keywords that come up for either of you when we're thinking about, especially the incongruities between those two signs? Pisces is very flexible, like probably the most flexible, I would say, of the mutable signs, which are themselves already flexible because it's like a mutable water sign, and water itself conforms to like whatever conforms to its surroundings, basically.
Yeah. Born to change, as opposed to fixed signs, which are born to never change, you know?
Yeah. With Pisces, I often think about this idea of feeling the inherent connection between everything, the coherence and the interconnection, this sort of manifestation of Jupiter ruling a water sign, a mutable water sign. And that really displaces this whole big deal placed on selfhood and things when it's like, oh, we are all one and you are me and I am you. Leo's like, what? What do you mean? Where are the boundaries?
If that's true, how am I going to be worshipped? How does that work?
Right. There can be kind of a feeling of like, I think when Leo kind of loses touch with that certainty about who they are, it can feel very like lost at sea. So I feel like Pisces can feel kind of like an environment that is very adrift and devoid of reference points to Leo placements. And, you know, again, my Leo rising bias, but Pisces in general is in kind of an 8th house relationship to Leo. And I think about that a lot in terms of the idea of the 8th house having sometimes something to do with those really deep, vulnerable, intimate parts of relationships, like trustful relationships where there is betrayal possible, there's fear and paranoia around that, all these 8th house things. And so I think that there can be kind of a fear around this Pisces idea of so much connection, so much interconnection. Because it's one thing for people to see you for who you are, or to be perceived if you are in the spotlight somehow or in a position of leadership. But it's another to like really share that vulnerable, intimate space with someone. And I think that can bring up, again, just some of that fear, anxiety, or doubt with Leo. Like, if someone sees the whole of me, like, what are they going to see? And like, will they accept it? So the connective qualities, I feel, can be kind of like tough for Leo, or feel a little sticky, where there's not enough boundary or like separation or distinction, I think is a better word.
I think Leo has a workaround for that, though, which is developing like a messianic complex, where, and I was looking up a definition really quickly, and it says a messiah complex, alternatively a Christ complex or savior complex, is a state of mind in which an individual holds a belief that they are destined to become a savior today or the near future. The term can also refer to a state of mind in which an individual believes that they are responsible for saving or assisting others. So maybe the like boundlessness and connectedness, it all works out as long as you're like the central one leading that whole thing.
David
100%.
David Koresh was a Leo. Yeah. Okay. I think the distinction is
who is he?
David Koresh, he was oh yeah, you guys are so young. He was the leader of this cult in Waco, Texas, called the Branch Davidians. And it was, it was this compound with lots of adults and kids, a few hundred people. The government, this is right when Clinton became president. It's like one of the first things that happened. It was the Bay of Pigs like what the Bay of Pigs was to JFK, the Waco thing was to Bill Clinton, where there were reports of child abuse and like unregistered weapons, and so government troops went in.
We don't need a whole breakdown of the Waco thing. He was a cult leader.
He was a cult leader and wound up burning down his whole sort of. Or his thing was burned down and all his people were killed. But yeah, he was super messianic. What I was trying to say, short version, Leos think they're the Messiah. Pisces actually are the Messiah. I mean, Jesus was a Pisces.
Maybe hypothetically he could have been.
In the sense that, like, the Pisces is supposed to be this sort of selfless individual. Leo could only wish to be, what the Pisces actually is. Although the Pisces would never do it for the sort of the Leo motivation to have the adoration or what have you. So no, there's a little something in that.
Yeah, no, you're right. So because part of his message was things like feed the poor, give away your money, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's always, I mean, that this whole, not to, I'm sorry, I know this is probably the first time in your podcast someone brings up the dreaded phrase age of Aquarius, but the age of Pisces is the Christian age, right? I mean, that's the whole reason we have these sort of, Pisces is often associated with the age of Christianity and all that stuff.
Yeah, or all this speculation. There's been like hundreds of speculative charts, but one of the ones historically people have often wondered about was there's a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Pisces, sometimes not long before the hypothetical historical figure of Jesus may have been born.
There's that, but I mean the symbol, the symbol of the fishes has always been associated with Christianity. Pisces has always had a certain affinity with that religion, as I've understood it.
Yeah,
mind you, what I understand about Christianity is about this much, but that's one of the things that's been imparted to me.
Yeah, but that's a good contrast. Then the contrast between like of a let's say a spiritual leader like that, of on the one hand having like a spiritual message or something like that, which is Pisces, of helpfulness and wanting to redeem or somehow raise up people that are in bad shape, versus Leo in the desire to be the center of something or in the limelight. And it's the tension between those two things, because they're kind of like not super compatible, but the way that they can sometimes get reconciled is by having somebody that's at the center of some larger thing like that, which can sometimes go well, other times not so well if you end up in like a cult type situation.
Yeah. I mean, Pisces, one word I think of with Pisces is selflessness. And that's just, you could have the greatest, most generous Leo in the world, but there'll never be selfless, like it's,
There's always going to be some like 1% that's like,
yeah,
a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, on that note, I think we're getting towards the end of this discussion, since we got in a solid 2 hours. I really hate to say this because I don't want it to go to anyone's head, but I feel like this may be the best discussion I've had so far in the series. I've really enjoyed this with both of you today. So thank you both for joining me. This was awesome.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Chris.
I guess you'll have to bring us on for the next 7 signs.
Right. Well, that's what's funny is this is like your 5th episode in a row during Leo season over the past month in a series, an era of the podcast that I've dubbed the Daganessence, but
yeah, that was very clever.
Well, what sucked about that is I did that like one day before, and then all of a sudden, like some singer I hadn't heard of before, like drops an album named Renaissance, like right after that. And so kind of got overshadowed a little bit. My funny joke about
nobody can overshadow me. Come on.
Yeah, right. Not even Beyonce.
No, right. Beyonce can. Okay. No. Let's be real.
Okay. All right. I like that. It's humility. That was good. That was a little.
I do have 4 planets in Virgo, one more than Joe, which I'll always remind you.
Speaking of humility, tell me about yourselves. Joe, what do you have going on? Where can people find out more information about you?
You can find me everywhere online at Joe Maker of Ways. So joemakerofways.com. And that's my handle on Instagram and Twitter. I offer consultations. I launch my availability once a month. So that'll be the 4th week of the month. And I focus on sort of narrative astrology, or a story-driven approach where there's a lot of storytelling, kind of using traditional Hellenistic astrology as the building blocks for that. And I have ended up specializing in the 12th house. So if you have a 12th house, whether or not it has planets in it, I would love to chat with you about it. So that's what I have going on right now.
I like that. So anybody with the 12th house, check out Joe's website, which I'll put a link to in the description below this video on YouTube, or on the Astrology Podcast website in the entry for this episode. Nick, what do you have going on, and where can people find out more information about you?
I can be found at nickdaganbestastrologer.com. These days I'm focused mainly on doing consultations, and I've got some video and writing projects that I'm working on. As far as chart specialties, I just sort of, whatever comes along, I'll talk about whatever house needs to be talked about.
All right, cool. Sounds good. Well, like I said, links to all those websites in the description of this video or on the podcast website. Thank you both so much for joining me. This has been amazing and has been a great, fifth episode in this series. We'll see how the next episode goes. We'll see if Virgo can top this. They've got a big, tall order to fill, but we'll see what happens.
Good luck.
All right, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Sorry,
All right, cool. Well, thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to all the patrons that helped us support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, and Jake Otero. If you like the work that I'm doing here on the podcast and you would like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through my page on patreon.com. And in exchange, you'll get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the month ahead forecast each month, access to a private monthly auspicious elections report that we put out each month, access to exclusive episodes that are only available for patrons, or you can also get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, go to patreon.com/astrologypodcast. The main software we use here on the podcast to look at astrological charts is called SolarFire for Windows, which is available at alabe.com, and you can use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we use a similar set of software by the same programming team called AstroGold for Mac OS, which is available from astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount on that as well. If you would like to learn more about the approach to astrology that I outline on the podcast, then you should check out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I traced the origins of Western astrology and reconstructed the original system that was developed about 2,000 years ago. And in this book, I outline basic concepts, but also take you into intermediate and advanced techniques for reading a birth chart, including some timing techniques. So you can find out more about the book at hellenisticastrology.com/book. The book pairs very well with my online course on ancient astrology called the Hellenistic Astrology Course, which has over 100 hours of video lectures where I go into detail about teaching you how to read a birth chart and showing hundreds of example charts in order to really demonstrate how the techniques work in practice. So find out more information about that at theastrologyschool.com. And finally, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is available at mountainastrologer.com, the Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, available at honeycomb.co, and the AstroGold Astrology app, which is available for iPhone and Android. You can find out more information about that at astrogold.io. There's also a major astrology conference happening this year that's being hosted by the International Society for Astrological Research, and that's happening August 25th through the 29th, 2022 in Westminster, Colorado. You can find out more information at isar2022.org.